Hello, welcome to BEH 215 Behavioral Healthcare Management. Today we'll be discussing managing poor performance, poor staffing performance. So, when we have individuals who are not performing their jobs well, who are social workers, the responsibility to take action is an ethical one as outlined in the NASW Code of Ethics, Standard 2.10, Incompetence of Colleagues. Social workers who have direct knowledge of a social work colleague's incompetence should consult with that colleague when feasible and assist the colleague in taking remedial action. So within the context of ethics, it is incumbent upon a behavioral health care worker, human services healthcare employee, or social worker to be aware that it is their responsibility to be aware that they cannot allow incompetence to continue. So how do we address these problems? Well, sometimes the best is to do nothing, and we call that natural consequences. Some behavioral problems a manager may choose to do nothing, at least initially. A conscious decision not to act at the present time can be appropriate when, based on the manager's experience and judgment, a problem is 1. Not a severe one, 2. Can be allowed to continue for a while, and 3. Is likely to go away naturally. Why would the behavior go away naturally? Sometimes it is something that, based on the manager's experience, often exists for a while and then disappears on its own. An example of this would be when you have a new employee. So a manager may conclude that it is usually not necessary to deal with the anger and frustration when you have a new child protective worker because based on past experiences, these outbursts are likely to stop as they get more comfortable on the job and learn how to cope better with the stresses that go along with the job. Natural consequences should not be confused with the unfortunate tendency of some managers to try to ignore a sticky problem because they are just not comfortable dealing with it. This is not dealing with a problem by natural consequences. So oftentimes with a new employee, what you're looking at is a period of adjustment, especially with someone who has just graduated from college or has just gotten their licensing or certification. You need to give them time to adjust, and you have to be able to be patient and, let them vent, let them get into the rhythm of the job, and they will adapt. If this person has been in the job for 10, 12, 15 years, and they are still freaking out all the time, this is when you need to step in as a manager and start to deal with it. One of the options is sanctions. Managers sometimes employ sanctions to punish certain behaviors that, while not grounds for firing an otherwise good employee, are unacceptable and should not be allowed to happen again. While they have limited use, they can be very effective. When sanctions are in place and/or penalties occur, staff members learn quickly or are reminded both what they are forbidden to do and the negative consequences of doing it. So, for example, a staff member was reimbursed for travel expenses for 2 home visits that it was discovered later he failed to make. There generally would be no effort to hide from other staff members the reason why the penalty was implied, because you want to make sure that everybody understands that doing this kind of shady action is going to result in consequences. So, these penalties are in place for the misuse of the organization's funds, and they are not simply idle threats, they will be imposed. So while you are not going out and announcing it to the entire staff that the sanction has been imposed, you are not necessarily trying to keep it hush-hush or confidential, and especially when the employee might share the information with his coworkers or her coworkers. So these kinds of situations do occur on a regular basis, and it just kind of reminds the other employees that certain actions may not necessarily result in a termination, but it will certainly put them in a situation where they will have sanctions, for example, be suspended for a few days. So let's talk about how do we eliminate staff problems. In most organizations, there is a procedure for addressing problems of inadequate staff performance of duties. It entails a sequence of actions of increasing severity that is referred to as progressive discipline. These two words are used across different jobs, different fields. It is one of the most commonly used methods for remediating behavior in every type of career field. Staff members may ignore the friendly reminders or nonverbal communication of a manager, such as facial expressions or body language, that express dissatisfaction with her job performance. When this happens, other forms of communication are required, ones that cannot be so easily ignored. So a staff member comes to work late on a regular basis, and you say to them, listen, you have to be here at 8. Clients have appointments at 8. You can't wander in at 8:30. And this is the kind of thing that they may tend to ignore, and you have to manage that. So then you go to that first step, which is a progressive, in the progressive discipline, which is a verbal reprimand. Now that's different than just saying, listen, you can't be late all the time. A verbal reprimand entails a direct, private, and confidential communication of the staff member's shortcomings. It is usually required to be documented. The reprimanded staff member may also be asked to sign it. Managers often dislike the use of verbal reprimands because they require direct confrontation, but it is a necessary step in the process of remediating behavior. So in this scenario, you as the manager and your employee would go into a room, and you might even have a third person as a witness in there. You would say to them, I'm here to discuss the fact that you are consistently late on a regular basis and your shift begins at 8 o'clock. I am hereby verbally warning you that you must be on time. Then that manager will follow up with an email, and they may even ask the employee to print out that email and sign it so that they can put it in, so that they acknowledge that they have been verbally warned about their lateness. An important point here is to reprimand in private and never in public. Reprimanding in public has the potential to embarrass rather than protect the offending individual from the gossip and ridicule of peers. Humiliating a person in public is a recipe for disaster. So I want you to think about all the times you've seen on the news when somebody has gotten fired or been criticized on their job in front of others, and they go home, they get their gun, and they come back and they start shooting people up. The reality is, people, when they feel diminished, when they feel belittled, when they feel humiliated, it's like being 7 years old on the playground, and they want to get back at the bully. Now, the manager might just be doing their job, but if they do their job poorly, they can have terrible consequences. Also, it is an undue hardship on the rest of the members of the work group. Group reprimands can be destructive to both morale and the kind of productive organizational climate that the manager is expected to create. So if you're reprimanding one person in front of a group, it's horrible, horrible. But then if you're trying to reprimand the entire group, it's even worse, because then you're now that third grade teacher yelling at her students, and the students are just kind of giving each other the look and rolling their eyes. So always reprimand in private with your employees, 1 or 2 at a time. Do not do it as a group. Then we move on to written reprimands. Depending upon the company's procedures, usually after 1 or 2 verbal reprimands and insufficient improvement, the next reprimand for the same problem is an official written reprimand. Copies of written reprimands or warnings are kept, usually in the employee's personnel record, although a manager may elect to use an under-the-table written reprimand, which by agreement with the staff member is removed from the record if the deficiency is corrected. This is one of those scenarios where a staff member may have been a long-time employee, 5, 6, 7 years. They've been great, and then they've been encountering some personal problems. They're being warned that if they do not remediate their problems, i.e. coming to work late, leaving early, not doing what they're supposed to be doing with their clients, that written warning doesn't actually end up in the personnel. It ends up in the manager's desk, and the manager says, if you don't have any more incidents of these problems in the next 3 months, I'm ripping this up and it'll have never existed. This is a good way to protect a good employee while also informing them that their behavior needs to be remediated. If they do not remediate their behavior, then that written reprimand goes from the manager's desk into the personnel file, and you use that as part of the reason why you may eventually terminate them. The staff member is asked to sign the written warning or the written reprimand. It is an important part of the paper trail that must be kept if a future personnel action becomes necessary. Some companies will use a contract or a final warning, and this outlines what has to be done to avoid termination. The staff member must sign the document agreeing to do what is exactly required, and what is written down is what is required. So, for example, let's say that you have a associate who is fraternizing with his clients. Absolutely the wrong thing to do. Not necessarily, having an intimate relationship, but maybe being friendly with them outside of work, being overly friendly. And you are putting it down to inexperience, and you have you've verbally warned them, you've done the written warning, and now you're writing the final warning. This is it. If you do not stop fraternizing outside of work with your clients, you will be terminated. There it is. Done. Now the employee understands. If this, then that. There is no wiggle room. There's no negotiation. And it's important that it be as simple as possible so that the staff member doesn't have any opportunity to misinterpret what you are saying. Termination because of unsatisfactory work performance is a last resort. You need a paper trail, and it should include a series of consistently low staff performance evaluations, oral and written reprimands, and 1 or more warnings. Nobody wants to fire anyone, and nobody wants to be fired. But when a termination has to occur, you have to make sure that all of your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed, because everybody likes to say, I have a lawyer and I'm going to sue. So, what constitutes a good termination? Number 1, be fair and considerate. The same criteria that apply to performance evaluations apply in firing a staff member. Fairness involves making the decision after providing as much help as possible and after carefully weighing the alternatives. As a manager, your job is to help your employee do a better job. And if they do not help themselves do a better job, then you have done everything you can. One should adhere to the ethical standards, to the rules, policy, and procedures as specified in manuals or other documents that the company has. Number 2, preserve the individual's dignity. Every effort should be made to not humiliate the staff member. The process should be kept as private as possible so as not to unnecessarily embarrass him or her. Be direct but tactful. There is no need to make it more personal than necessary. It is an individual's job performance, not the individual him or herself, that makes the termination necessary. Number 3, reduce the legal risk to the organization. As I mentioned earlier, everyone has a lawyer. Everyone wants to sue. Everyone has the idea that they can own the company. You want to try to avoid charges of discrimination or wrongful discharge by having that paper trail. Number 4, preserve the organization's reputation. Even if there are no legal grounds to file a lawsuit or grievance or otherwise protest the action, the reputation of the organization can be damaged by an angry, fired staff member or co-worker and friends who criticize the decision in the community. In other words, when you actually do the termination, be kind about it. You don't want to put that person in a confrontational environment, although that person is already going to be extremely upset and angry. And finally, you want to minimize disruption of the work environment. The organizational climate can be seriously damaged by the knowledge that a coworker has been fired and or by his or her continued presence following the notice of termination. A manager may have to make special efforts to address any disruption before it gets too severe and begins to interfere with the work of the organization. When you have an employee who is really doing a bad job and everybody knows it, it is better to expedite the termination process because the other employees are going to get angry and resentful. On the other hand, if you have an employee who is very, very well liked, but who is doing a poor job, you're going to have to deal with that as well. So let's talk about the optics of unfairness, and what that means is how you are perceived, how it is perceived. Suppose that all of the required measures to ensure due process have been used properly and just cause has been established. There still remains the possibility that the decision to terminate a staff member for unsatisfactory performance could be viewed as unfair or discriminatory. So, for example, is there anything in the staff member's record to contradict the conclusion that the worker cannot do the job adequately? Do any recent performance evaluations state that the staff member meets expectations? Any of this would make this difficult, if not impossible, to fire the worker at the present time. Managers must be prepared to deal with the staff members who are angry and resentful. The focus should be getting back to work. Now, for example, let's say you have an employee who is working in a drug rehab facility. This employee comes to work. It is obvious to you this employee is either drunk or high. You send them for an immediate drug test. They fail. This employee knows there is a zero tolerance because it is a rehab facility. Well, this is the kind of scenario that people might get angry because they may not know what happened. And in this kind of scenario, you have to balance the confidential information with managing the staff members who might see it as unfair. So, terminating the employee. Once the decision is made to fire a staff member because of continued unsatisfactory work performance, a private meeting should be scheduled. Who should be there? The manager, the employee, and a witness. Usually a personnel officer, or a higher level administrator should also be present. When should it occur? If there is no sense of urgency, termination interviews usually are scheduled at the end of the day. This way, the employee will not have to face coworkers afterward and can go home to the support of family and/or friends. What should occur? The manager should make it clear from the outset that termination is the meeting's focus and that the decision is not reversible. Avoid an argument by reiterating that the decision is final and by not becoming defensive. In other words, a statement like this decision is final, it will not be reconsidered, and that is it. Do not apologize, do not say you're sorry. It is a matter of you have created a series of events that have put us in a situation where we have no other choice. Other factors you need to consider. Future employment advice will probably go unappreciated in the emotion of the moment and might only make this terminated staff member angry. So don't really get real chatty during the termination meeting. Supportive comments that are intended to be kind also may be resented. Skip them. Some comments might even provide ammunition for a grievance or lawsuit. For example, statements to staff members terminated for unsatisfactory work performance such as, "I recognize that it must be difficult to try to learn so much new stuff at your age," or "I'm sure that being the only Asian American didn't make your job any easier," should never be made. They are almost certain to land the manager and the organization in a discrimination suit. Additionally, make no reference whatsoever to any demographic characteristics of the staff member. A termination interview should not be allowed to go on once the necessary business has been completed. 15-20 minutes max. Make sure you have information, if there is any information about if there is a separation package, meaning if there's COBRA, health insurance continuance, if there's going to be a severance package, if there's any information that they need to have about when they can come and get their stuff, anything like that. All of that should be ready to go for the employee at that moment. Some staff members do their jobs marginally well, meeting minimum requirements, but they are absent much of the time. In many organizations, there is a way to dismiss staff members who are chronically absent from work called job abandonment. Job abandonment can be a quick and relatively painless way to remove an individual from employment. No prior warning is needed. It requires only a written notice of the action, i.e., abandonment of position, a listing of the dates during which the employee was absent, and a reminder that he or she has been charged the appropriate number of days of unauthorized leave. So, for example, your average employee may have 5 sick days and somewhere between 10 to 15 vacation days. And then, of course, holidays like Christmas or Easter. So, those days are authorized leaves. You are going to then have some employees who have FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. Those are also going to be authorized. But then you also have employees who just are always out. They have pink eye, then they have the flu, then they have a toenail that's bothering them, then they have a sick kid, which is fine. Everybody has kids. Well, not everybody, but most people have kids, and we all have a sick kid once in a while. But when these numbers begin to add up and go beyond the number of days the employer gives the employee as authorized leave, and then you begin to see a significant amount of unauthorized leave, is that employee able to do their job? No, because they're not there. So in this context, they're abandoning their job. Then we have gross misconduct, which occurs because an individual is believed to have done something so intolerable that he or she needs to be fired on the spot. Termination is the result of some behavior that has occurred on or off the job that is clearly forbidden in writing or is an obvious violation of professional ethics. It does not require a course of progressive discipline. There is no prior warning required. Termination for gross misconduct is not a matter of discretion or judgment for the manager. If termination did not occur, the manager would be faulted for doing nothing, for not doing what he or she should have done. So, for example, you're managing a drug rehab facility. You find out one of the techs or the counselors is bringing drugs into the facility for one of the clients. That is gross misconduct. You can terminate them on the spot. Here are some common examples of gross misconduct: drinking or substance abuse on the job, stealing, violence or threats of violence, conviction of a felony, behavior injurious to the good of the organization or its clients, sexual harassment, violations of ethics, and refusal to follow reasonable orders. Finally, exit interviews, which are usually conducted on a staff member's last day on the job, are customarily offered to all employees who are leaving the organization, except for those fired for gross misconduct. When an employee leaves voluntarily, the interview generally entails a pleasant exchange between the manager and the departing staff member, and perhaps some constructive suggestions for changes by the individual about the company that he or she might previously have been reluctant to make. For the staff member who has been involuntarily terminated for unsatisfactory work performance or job abandonment, the offer of an exit interview may be refused, and is often refused. It is usually refused, usually with some choice words. The manager should offer one, but should not force it, because then it's just going to get ugly. Anyway, that is that is the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. If you are not in my class, please feel free to leave me a comment, and I'm going to try and get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much, and have a great day.